Dr. Leroy Hopkins is a professor at Millersville, a historian, and is very astute in the African American heritage and the Civil War, and especially the Underground Railroad. Dr. Hopkins, you're on.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, for a little truth in advertising, I'm a professor of German, and I do local history. I have a question. How many of you lived in the city before 1960? Anyone? A couple. Before 1960, there were 9 wards, but there was only the ward. It was called the ward because it was the 7th ward. That's where most blacks lived. But when this cemetery was established in 1836, this was a black neighborhood. This was a portion of Spring Garden. Martin Shreiner lived there. Back here, Arch Street, North Arch, above Walnut, is where the African Union Church was settled, or was created. Isaac Gilmore was the founding member of the African Union Church. As a matter of fact, in the northwest quadrant of Lancaster City, during the period 1820 to 1900, there were at least 4 black churches. All of them have, of course, disappeared by now. My church, Bethel AME Church, is, and we say with justification, is the oldest African-American church in the county. We were organized in 1817, although there was some problems. The construction was completed in 1817, but we couldn't pay for it. So 1818 is actually when the church was paid off. And 1821, Christian Endres, who was the pastor at Trinity Lutheran Church, came to Bethel, interestingly enough, in the month of February, maybe that's why it's Black History Month, and preached a dedicatory sermon. But according to the program, I'm supposed to talk about heritage, Civil War, and the Underground Railroad. Well, normally that's a 4-hour presentation, but I'll cut it in half. Lancaster, of course, was organized in 1730. African Americans were in the county well before that. There's a record of a African working with a Frenchman in the lower Susquehanna in 1699. The first Africans in the, shall we say, the somewhat modern period, came to the area of Columbia in 1726. And we know that because there's a will from 1745, Samuel Blunston's will, that lists the mulattoes and so forth. Columbia actually was the important center for African Americans before the Civil War. Lancaster does not grow in importance for African Americans until after the Civil War. And Randy has mentioned that there's a couple, or at least one Civil War veteran who's buried at this end of the cemetery. There are in the county over 150 African American Civil War veterans buried. Now this one, Jonathan Sweeney, I did not find. I wrote an article, I believe it was 17 years ago, it's 1993, for the Journal of the Lancaster County Historical Society. And in researching African Americans, any group like that, a marginalized group, you have to do digging. I spent yesterday in Harrisburg walking with a German student that I met the week before during the Grand Review in Harrisburg. Her name is Martina Schaefer. And Martina Schaefer is here from Berlin, and she has an interesting project. In Harrisburg and then later in San Diego, she's researching what happened when, for example, in Harrisburg, Market Street for a brief time was named Martin Luther King Boulevard, and then the name was taken away by a group who agitated for that, called Retaining or Getting Back Our History. Now, our history, what is our history? Usually our history excludes individuals, and that was the problem in Lancaster City. As I mentioned, African Americans lived in all 4 quadrants. If you want to find out who some of them were, actually this was a long time ago, 1984, I published an article called the Negro Entry Book. The Negro Entry Book was the result of an ordinance passed in 1820 that required every free person of color coming into Lancaster or leaving Lancaster to register at the mayor's office. Failure to do so.
Keep it anymore.
Failure to do so meant a fine of $1 a day. Now you have to remember, in the 1820s, if you didn't pay your debts, you ended up in the almshouse, and there was no getting out of the almshouse. You stayed there for the rest of your life. And I wrote an article. I found the entry book by accident with the help of John Ongst. Some of you may remember John. John was the administrator of the Historical Society, I found this ordinance. Actually, I found it in a book written by Jack Lewis, Heritage of Lancaster. And in his book, he mentioned an ordinance had been passed. And of course, I was curious. I found the ordinance in the county archives. And then I went to the Historical Society and I said, John, you know anything about this ordinance? And John said, just a minute. He goes to his office. Now, for those of you who remember John, his office, his desk was piled up this high with books and papers, but he knew where everything was. And he goes in these pile, comes back, and gives me the entry book. Someone had donated it to the Historical Society just a couple weeks before. I read through it, and it is a treasure trove of information on African Americans. I highly recommend it to you. In there, in the first year, 1820, almost 90% of African Americans living in the city are registered. And some of the entries are very illuminating. The first one is by James Clendenin. James Clendenin, excuse me, was a painter and glazier. He lived in his own house on Middle Street, which is today's Howard Avenue. And he had 2 children living with him, not related to him. And that's one of the things you'll find out when you read the entries about Spring Garden. This area was called Spring Garden. The boy who lived with James Clendenin was there to learn the trade. Isaac Gilmore, who lived on Water Street, he also brought in young men, some from as far away as Philadelphia, to learn the trade of chimney sweeping. Chimney sweeping was very important. Most of the roofs were wooden, and so the sparks from the fire would land on the roof, and you had potentially no house. So therefore, chimney sweep was an important profession. As a glazier, that is someone who makes glass, James Clendenin was an important intermediary between his community and the white community. So important that when Bethel AME Church, or back then it wasn't called Bethel AME, it was called the African Church, when they decided to organize a place of worship, they met at Clendenin's house, and then he talked to his contacts, William Kirkpatrick, Robert Coleman, and so forth, the prominent members of St. James and Trinity Lutheran. And with their support and approval. Now, the support wasn't coming through. They'd hoped for money, but St. James and Trinity Lutheran at that time were rebuilding their own congregations, or rebuilding their own structures. But the approval was important because it was dangerous for African Americans to get together without the authorities knowing why they were there. And the reason for that goes back, now this is 1817. In 1803 in York, there was the so-called Negro Plot of York. Houses in York suddenly caught fire, and blamed were the Africans living there. Some were slaves, some were indentured servants. And so therefore in Lancaster, it was decided, well, this is the safe stratagem. And they asked for a minister from Baltimore to come, Daniel Coker, although he never actually came. Instead, another, David Smith, came. Probably no relation to the David Smiths today. He came and he helped them with this stratagem. Now, I could probably stop there, otherwise I'd go on for another half hour or so. But the interesting thing is, what you need to take from what I've just said is that Lancaster City was a multicultural city from the beginning. African Americans did not always live in the southeast area. They lived in every quadrant, and they were businessmen. If you go to the period before the Civil War, in Center Square, there were black men who had businesses. Robert Boston, for example, was a barber. Charles Williams was a barber. Barbering, chimney sweep, and also glazier. Those were 3 important professions that African Americans were involved in. And that would have been the beginning of a middle class. But what came was, in this post-Civil War period, the opportunity that the veterans went off to fight for were denied. And so therefore, Lancaster's black population declines from 1865 to about 1950. If you look at the census for 1910, 1920, you had about 2,500 African Americans living in the county, majority in Lancaster. And it's not until after 1950 that number increases. So that's a little segment. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
I have a question. You were talking about the colored veterans that were buried in the county. Do you have any information on the 53rd or 54th Massachusetts troops that are buried north of 30 in Columbia?
The 54th and 55th. The 54th, Governor Andrew of Massachusetts was smart. Lincoln had called for volunteers, and each state was supposed to send a certain number. And the governor of Massachusetts said, this war is about slavery. He recognized it was about slavery. Later, say, oh no, it's about states' rights. Well, the states were fighting about the rights to own slaves. And so he sent out this appeal. Most of the men who joined the Massachusetts 54th, and of course that's the regiment that was talked about in the movie Glory, came from Pennsylvania. If you look at the regimental history written by Emilio, who was a captain in the regiment, you can go from Philadelphia west to Pittsburgh. Every county contributed a certain number. In my article, it's called No Balm in Gilead, the Civil War in Lancaster County's African American community. And I mentioned some of those men. One of the men from the 54th, he didn't actually join in Columbia. He was from Columbia, but he joined in Elmira, New York. That was Stephen Swales. And he was probably the first African American to get a field command or field promotion. He joined as a sergeant in Elmira, New York, because he worked on the Susquehanna. And during the period of the war, 1863 to 65, he was wounded at least twice, once in Olustee in Florida. And he was promoted, although he had to fight for the promotion after the Civil War, to second lieutenant. And then later, and that's another aspect that's not usually emphasized in history classes, black Pennsylvanians went south and were a part of the Reconstruction government. Stephen Swales, William J. Whipper, the nephew of William Whipper from Columbia, and also, what was his name, from Luzerne County, Jonathan Jasper Wright, was admitted to the bar in South Carolina, and they were a part of the Reconstruction government. And that Reconstruction government did things, or tried to do things, that today would be considered very advanced. They fought for equal education for everyone, not just for themselves. The story of the Reconstruction era has been, shall we say, lied about. If you've seen Birth of a Nation, completely false. What they tried to do was they tried to create a just society, something they themselves had never experienced. Other questions? If not, I don't want to prolong the program since we do have to be at the other place at 2 o'clock. If you have questions, I'll talk to you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hopkins.